The silk of the invitations usually felt like a promise. But tonight, the heavy cardstock felt like a jagged blade pressed against Clarice Lund's throat. Just 3 hours ago she was a bride-to-be with a life mapped out in pastel linens and shared bank accounts. Now she was a woman standing in a cold hallway, staring at the space where a moving truck had stripped her world bare. Her fiancé hadn't just broken their engagement. He had systematically erased her, leaving behind nothing but a rented apartment and a single shimmering gown he'd told her she was too plain to ever pull off. The silence of the room was deafening, a physical weight pressing the air from her lungs. But as the clock chimed toward the hour of the Royal Solstice Gala, the event of the century, a flicker of something dangerous ignited in Clarice's chest. It wasn't just sadness. It was the raw, serrated edge of a woman who had been told she was invisible for far too long. She didn't just want to survive this night. She wanted to haunt the memory of every person who thought she was disposable. Before we dive into this journey of heartbreak and royal scandal, I want to say a huge hello to all of you joining us today. It is so wonderful to have you here in our storytelling corner. Whether you're tuning in from the bustling streets of New York, the quiet highlands of Scotland, or the sunny coasts of Australia, wherever you are, I hope you're doing absolutely wonderful today. We've been growing so fast lately, and it's all because of your incredible support. If you haven't already, please do hit that subscribe button and join our family. It helps us keep these emotional stories coming your way. And tell me in the comments right now, where are you watching from? I love reading your locations. Clarice's fingers trembled as she reached for the zipper of the midnight blue silk gown. The fabric felt like liquid moonlight, a stark contrast to the hollow ache in her ribs. She looked in the mirror, and for a moment she didn't recognize the woman staring back. The redness in her eyes from the afternoon's tears had faded into a fierce, glassy shimmer. She wasn't just dressing up. She was armor-plating her soul. The gala was held at the Ethelgard Palace, a place of soaring marble arches and secrets whispered in gold-leafed corridors. As Clarice stepped out of the hired car, the scent of expensive lilies and wood smoke filled the air. She had no business being here. Her name had been removed from the guest list the moment the engagement ended, yet she held her head with a defiance that bypassed the guard's scrutiny. As she crossed the threshold into the ballroom, the music seemed to dip, a collective intake of breath rippling through the crowd. She was a ghost in a room full of statues, vibrant, aching, and terrifyingly beautiful. She didn't see the whispers or the judgmental glares of her ex-fiance's friends. She only saw the man standing at the far end of the dais. The prince. He was a man known for a heart of stone and a gaze that could peel back the layers of a person's lies. Their eyes met across a sea of champagne flutes and silk coattails, and in that split second the atmosphere in the room shifted. It wasn't just a look. It was a collision. Clarice felt a jolt of electricity that made her pulse skip, a sensation of being seen for the first time in a decade. But as she took a step toward the center of the floor, a familiar, mocking voice hissed her name from the shadows. Her ex-fiancé was here. And he wasn't alone. The question hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Would Clarice crumble under the weight of her public humiliation, or was she about to ignite a fire that would burn the kingdom's social hierarchy to the ground? The marble floor of the Ethelgard Palace felt as cold as the remnants of Clarice Lund's dignity. Every click of her borrowed heels was a heartbeat, thumping, erratic, and terrified. To the onlookers she was a vision in midnight silk, a woman who looked like she owned the very air she breathed. But beneath the corset, Clarice was a mosaic of shattered expectations. Growing up as the daughter of a disgraced academic, Clarice had spent her life trying to be small, trying to be enough for a world that demanded pedigree she didn't possess. Her deepest fear wasn't poverty. It was irrelevance, the haunting idea that she could disappear from a room and no one would notice the silence. Her ex-fiancé, Julian Thorne, had spent 3 years cultivating that fear, pruning her confidence like a gardener cutting away wild overgrowth until she was a pale imitation of herself. He hadn't just broken her heart. He had tried to convince her she didn't have one worth keeping. "You look like you're waiting for the floor to swallow you," a voice rasped, cutting through the haze of her internal monologue. Clarice turned to find Elena Ripley, her only true confidant and a woman whose sharp tongue was the only thing more famous than her family's textile empire. Elena grabbed Clarice's hand, her grip grounding and fierce. "Don't you dare look down, Clarice. You aren't here as his shadow anymore. You're the sun. Let him burn if he looks too closely. I feel like a fraud, Elena, Clarice whispered, her voice barely audible over the swelling orchestra. I'm wearing a dress that costs more than my father's library. I don't belong here. Belonging is a lie told by people who are afraid of outsiders, Elena countered, adjusting a loose strand of Clarice's hair. Look at them. They're all wearing masks. Yours just happens to be made of silk. Across the room, standing on the velvet-draped dais, Prince Alaric Sterling watched the exchange with an intensity that bordered on predatory. To the kingdom, Alaric was the glacier prince, efficient, unyielding, and entirely uninterested in the parade of débutantes thrown his way. But the crown weighed more than gold. It weighed like lead. Alaric lived in a world where every smile was a transaction and every "I love you" was a bid for power. He was suffocating in a vacuum of sincerity. He saw the way Clarice held herself, the slight tremor in her chin that she masked with a sharp, defiant tilt of her head. He saw the way she looked at the opulence not with greed, but with a weary sort of recognition. She looked like someone who had lost everything and realized with a start that it made her dangerous. "Your Highness," his advisor Silas Vane murmured at his shoulder. "The Duchess of Oakhaven is waiting for a dance. It would be politically prudent to—" "The woman in the midnight blue," Alaric interrupted, his voice a low vibration. "Who is she?" Silas squinted through his spectacles. "A nobody, sir. Or rather, a formerly somebody. That's the woman Julian Thorne discarded this afternoon. A commoner with a scholarship background. She shouldn't even be on the grounds." Alaric didn't pull his gaze away. He watched as Julian Thorne approached Clarice, a smug, possessive smirk playing on his lips, and he felt a rare hot spark of irritation flare in his gut. Julian didn't look like a man who had lost a treasure. He looked like a man who was annoyed his trash hadn't stayed in the bin. Clarice felt Julian before she saw him. The scent of his expensive, cloying cologne, the one she used to tell him she liked just to keep the peace, hit her like a physical blow. "Clarice," Julian drawled, his eyes roaming over her dress with a mixture of shock and disdain. "I didn't realize you had the stomach for public humiliation. Did you steal that, or is this a final desperate grab at my attention?" The sting was sharp, but for the first time it didn't paralyze her. Clarice looked at the man she had almost tied her soul to and realized he was small. He was a collection of expensive fabrics and cheap cruelty. "I'm not here for you, Julian," she said, her voice gaining a steady, crystalline quality. "In fact, I'd forgotten you were attending. I'm here for the music." Julian laughed, a harsh, jagged sound. "The music? You're a mouse playing at being a lioness. You have no title, no money, and now no protector. By tomorrow morning, the guards will have escorted you to the gates, and you'll be back in the gutter where I found you." He reached out to grab her arm, his fingers tightening with a familiarity that made Clarice's skin crawl. But before his hand could close, a shadow fell over them both. A shadow that commanded the very air in the ballroom to go still. "I believe the lady said she was here for the music," a deep, authoritative voice rang out. Julian froze. His face went from pale to ashen in a heartbeat. He stepped back, his hand dropping as if burned as Prince Alaric stepped into the light. The prince didn't look at Julian. He looked only at Clarice, his eyes searching hers with a curiosity that felt like a spark hitting dry kindling. "And it would be a shame," Alaric continued, extending a hand toward Clarice, "to let such a beautiful melody go to waste without a partner." The silence in the room was absolute. Clarice looked at the royal hand offered to her, the hand that held the future of the kingdom, and then at Julian's crumbling expression. This was the moment. The precipice. Before we see if Clarice takes that hand and changes her life forever, I have to ask, have you ever had a moment where you stood up for yourself when everyone expected you to fail? Tell me about your lioness moment in the comments. And if you're enjoying Clarice's journey, make sure you've liked this video. It really helps the channel grow. Clarice took a breath, felt the silk of her gown rustle against her legs, and placed her hand in Alaric's. "I would be honored, Your Highness," she whispered. The moment Clarice's gloved hand met the prince's, a literal spark of static electricity jumped between them, a sharp crack that seemed to echo louder than the orchestra's violins. Prince Alaric Sterling didn't flinch. Instead, his fingers closed around hers with a possessive strength that sent a surge of heat straight to Clarice's core. Behind them, Julian Thorne stood frozen, his mouth slightly agape, looking like a man who had just watched his discarded pawn transform into a queen on the chessboard. The whispers in the ballroom rose like a swarm of disturbed hornets. Who is she? Is that Thorne's runaway bride? Why is the prince touching a commoner? Alaric led her toward the center of the dance floor, the crowd parting like the Red Sea. He didn't look at the dukes or the ambassadors. His silver-gray eyes were locked onto Clarice's with an intensity that felt like a physical weight. "You're trembling," Alaric murmured, his voice a low, private vibration that only she could hear as he pulled her into the formal frame of a waltz. "I'm surrounded by people who want to see me fail, Your Highness," Clarice whispered back, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. "Including the man I was supposed to marry this morning." Trembling feels like the only honest reaction. Alaric's hand on her waist tightened, drawing her a fraction closer than etiquette strictly allowed. "Then let them watch." There is nothing more terrifying to a crowd of pretenders than a woman who has stopped pretending. As the music swelled into a haunting minor key melody, they began to move. Alaric danced with a predatory grace, guiding Clarice through the intricate steps as if they had been partners for a lifetime. For a few minutes the palace blurred. The gold leaf, the judgmental stares, and the stinging memory of Julian's betrayal faded into the background. There was only the scent of Alaric's sandalwood cologne and the steady, grounding rhythm of his lead. But the piece was a thin glass mask. Suddenly the music didn't just end, it stopped with a jarring, discordant screech of strings. The massive oak doors at the far end of the ballroom slammed open with a violence that made the crystal chandeliers rattle. A man drenched in rain, his face pale and eyes wide with a manic sort of desperation, stumbled into the light. It was Arthur Sterling, Alaric's younger cousin, and a man known more for his gambling debts than his royal duties. He clutched a leather satchel to his chest as if it were a shield. "Alaric!" Arthur gasped, his voice cracking with terror. "They're coming. The vaults. The seals are broken. Someone leaked the succession ledgers." A collective gasp sucked the air out of the room. The succession ledgers weren't just documents. They were the blood right of the Sterling line, containing the secret genealogy that proved the legitimacy of the throne. If those were compromised, the kingdom was no longer a monarchy, it was a target for civil war. Alaric went still, his body turning into a pillar of ice. He didn't let go of Clarice's hand, but his gaze shifted to the shadows of the balcony, where several dark-clad figures were already moving with a practiced, lethal silence. "Silas!" Alaric barked at his advisor, who was already rushing forward. "Lock down the east wing. No one leaves this ballroom. Not the ambassadors, not the staff, and especially not the Lord of Thorne." Clarice felt the air turn cold. She looked at Julian, who was backing away toward the heavy velvet curtains, a look of calculating greed replacing his earlier shock. In that moment she realized this wasn't just a party. It was a trap. And she, the woman who had walked in with nothing but a broken heart and a blue dress, was standing at the epicenter of a coup. "Your Highness," Clarice whispered, her instinct for survival, honed by years of navigating her father's precarious reputation, kicking in. "Fleant, he knew. He told me this morning I'd be back in the gutter by tomorrow. He didn't just break the engagement, he was clearing his path." Alaric looked down at her, his eyes narrowing. "You're sure?" "He's a man who never does anything without a profit margin," she said, her voice hard. Before Alaric could respond, the lights in the ballroom flickered and died, plunging the room into a terrifying, suffocating blackness. Screams erupted. The sound of breaking glass and scuffling feet filled the air. In the dark, Clarice felt a hand grab her arm, not Alaric's steady grip but a rough, bruising pull. "Come with me, little mouse," a voice hissed in her ear. It was Julian. "You've seen too much and you're going to be my leverage to get out of this palace alive." But Clarice wasn't the small, compliant woman he had discarded anymore. She reached down, felt the heavy silver candlestick on the nearby table, and swung with every ounce of her reclaimed rage. There was a sickening thud, a groan, and the weight on her arm vanished. "Alaric!" she shouted into the void. Suddenly, a warm, strong hand found hers in the chaos. "I'm here," Alaric's voice grounded her. "Stay close. We're leaving through the servant passages. If they want a war for the crown, they'll have to find it first." As they ducked behind a hidden tapestry into the narrow, torchlit corridors of the palace, Clarice realized her life had changed forever. She had come here to capture a heart, but she had stumbled into a revolution. Now I have to ask you, if you were Clarice, would you run for the exit or would you follow the prince into the unknown? Drop a stay or run in the comments right now. And don't forget to subscribe if you want to see how this high-stakes romance unfolds. The moment Clarice's gloved hand met the prince's, a literal spark of static electricity jumped between them, a sharp crack that seemed to echo louder than the orchestra's violins. Prince Alaric Sterling didn't flinch. Instead, his fingers closed around hers with a possessive strength that sent a surge of heat straight to Clarice's core. Behind them, Julian Thorne stood frozen, his mouth slightly agape, looking like a man who had just watched his discarded pawn transform into a queen on the chessboard. The whispers in the ballroom rose like a swarm of disturbed hornets. Who is she? Is that Thorne's runaway bride? Why is the prince touching a commoner? Alaric led her toward the center of the dance floor, the crowd parting like the Red Sea. He didn't look at the dukes or the ambassadors. His silver-gray eyes were locked onto Clarice's with an intensity that felt like a physical weight. "You're trembling," Alaric murmured, his voice a low, private vibration that only she could hear as he pulled her into the formal frame of a waltz. "I'm surrounded by people who want to see me fail, Your Highness," Clarice whispered back, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. "Including the man I was supposed to marry this morning." Trembling feels like the only honest reaction. Alaric's hand on her waist tightened, drawing her a fraction closer than etiquette strictly allowed. "Then let them watch." There is nothing more terrifying to a crowd of pretenders than a woman who has stopped pretending. As the music swelled into a haunting minor key melody, they began to move. Alaric danced with a predatory grace, guiding Clarice through the intricate steps as if they had been partners for a lifetime. For a few minutes, the palace blurred. The gold leaf, the judgmental stares, and the stinging memory of Julian's betrayal faded into the background. There was only the scent of Alaric's sandalwood cologne and the steady, grounding rhythm of his lead. But the piece was a thin glass mask. Suddenly, the music didn't just end, it stopped with a jarring, discordant screech of strings. The massive oak doors at the far end of the ballroom slammed open with a violence that made the crystal chandeliers rattle. A man drenched in rain, his face pale and eyes wide with a manic sort of desperation, stumbled into the light. It was Arthur Sterling, Alaric's younger cousin, and a man known more for his gambling debts than his royal duties. He clutched a leather satchel to his chest as if it were a shield. "Alaric!" Arthur gasped, his voice cracking with terror. "They're coming. The vaults. The seals are broken. Someone leaked the succession ledgers." A collective gasp sucked the air out of the room. The succession ledgers weren't just documents. They were the blood right of the Sterling line, containing the secret genealogy that proved the legitimacy of the throne. If those were compromised, the kingdom was no longer a monarchy, it was a target for civil war. Alaric went still, his body turning into a pillar of ice. He didn't let go of Clarice's hand, but his gaze shifted to the shadows of the balcony, where several dark-clad figures were already moving with a practiced, lethal silence. "Silas!" Alaric barked at his advisor, who was already rushing forward. "Lock down the east wing. No one leaves this ballroom. Not the ambassadors, not the staff, and especially not the Lord of Thorne." Clarice felt the air turn cold. She looked at Julian, who was backing away toward the heavy velvet curtains, a look of calculating greed replacing his earlier shock. In that moment she realized this wasn't just a party. It was a trap. And she, the woman who had walked in with nothing but a broken heart and a blue dress, was standing at the epicenter of a coup. "Your Highness," Clarice whispered, her instinct for survival, honed by years of navigating her father's precarious reputation, kicking in. He knew. "He told me this morning I'd be back in the gutter by tomorrow." He didn't just break the engagement, he was clearing his path. Alaric looked down at her, his eyes narrowing. "You're sure?" "He's a man who never does anything without a profit margin," she said, her voice hard. Before Alaric could respond, the lights in the ballroom flickered and died, plunging the room into a terrifying, suffocating blackness. Screams erupted. The sound of breaking glass and scuffling feet filled the air. In the dark, Clarice felt a hand grab her arm, not Alaric's steady grip but a rough, bruising pull. "Come with me, little mouse," a voice hissed in her ear. It was Julian. "You've seen too much and you're going to be my leverage to get out of this palace alive." But Clarice wasn't the small, compliant woman he had discarded anymore. She reached down, felt the heavy silver candlestick on the nearby table, and swung with every ounce of her reclaimed rage. There was a sickening thud, a groan, and the weight on her arm vanished. "Alaric!" she shouted into the void. Suddenly, a warm, strong hand found hers in the chaos. "I'm here," Alaric's voice grounded her. "Stay close. We're leaving through the servant passages. If they want a war for the crown, they'll have to find it first." As they ducked behind a hidden tapestry into the narrow, torchlit corridors of the palace, Clarice realized her life had changed forever. She had come here to capture a heart, but she had stumbled into a revolution. Now I have to ask you, if you were Clarice, would you run for the exit or would you follow the prince into the unknown? Drop a "stay" or "run" in the comments right now. And don't forget to subscribe if you want to see how this high-stakes romance unfolds. The air in the servant passages was thick with the scent of damp stone and centuries-old secrets. Prince Alaric Sterling pulled Clarice Lund through a labyrinth of narrow corridors, his hand a crushing, grounding weight on hers. Behind them, the muffled screams and crashing glass of the ballroom faded, replaced by the rhythmic thud of their own boots on the uneven floor. "In here," Alaric hissed, shoving open a heavy oak door that led into a forgotten archive room. The walls were lined with decaying scrolls, and the only light came from a sliver of moon cutting through a high, barred window. Clarice leaned against a stack of dusty ledgers, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The midnight blue silk of her dress was torn at the hem, a jagged reminder of her escape from Julian's grip. "Why are we hiding in a closet, Alaric? You're the prince. You have guards. You have an army." Alaric turned to her, his face half-shadowed. The Glacier Prince facade was gone, replaced by a raw, jagged intensity. "In that ballroom I have enemies I haven't named yet. If the succession ledgers were leaked, it means someone inside my inner circle, someone with a key to the royal vault, has turned. Until I know who, every guard is a potential assassin." He stepped closer, the space between them shrinking until Clarice could feel the heat radiating from his chest. "And you," he murmured, his gaze dropping to the bruise blooming on her arm where Julian had grabbed her. "You shouldn't be here. You should have been home, safe and bored, crying over a man who didn't deserve a single one of your tears." Clarice felt a flash of heat that had nothing to do with fear. "I stopped crying at 4 p.m. today, Your Highness. And don't tell me where I should be. If I hadn't been there, you wouldn't have known Julian was involved." Alaric's eyes narrowed, a flicker of admiration crossing his features. "Julian Thorne is a vulture. He doesn't lead coups, he waits for the lions to kill each other so he can pick the carcass. If he's involved, someone much more powerful is pulling his strings." Suddenly, the sound of heavy boots echoed in the corridor outside. Clang, clang, clang. The rhythmic metal of palace guard armor. "Search every room," a voice commanded. It was Silas Vane, Alaric's trusted advisor. "The prince is compromised. Find the girl. She's the key." Clarice's blood turned to ice. "Silas? But he was your right hand." "Power doesn't want a hand," Alaric whispered, pulling her into the deepest shadows behind a row of towering bookshelves. "It wants the whole body." As the guards hammered on the doors nearby, Alaric pressed Clarice against the stone wall. The proximity was dizzying. Her senses were filled with him. The scent of rain and adrenaline, the hard line of his jaw, the way his thumb mindedly traced the pulse point at her wrist. In the face of certain death, the attraction that had sparked on the dance floor roared into a bonfire. "If we get out of this," Alaric whispered, his breath ghosting over her lips, "I'm going to find out who you really are, Clarice Lund. Beyond the dress and the heartbreak. I'm a woman who has nothing left to lose," she breathed back. "That makes me the most dangerous person in this palace." The door to the archive creaked open. A beam of lantern light sliced through the darkness, crawling across the floor like a predatory snake. Clarice held her breath, her heart drumming a frantic rhythm against Alaric's palm. The light stopped inches from his boot. "Clear," a guard shouted. The door slammed shut and the footsteps retreated. Alaric exhaled, a long, shaky breath. He didn't move away. For a heartbeat, the world was just the two of them suspended in the dark. He reached out, his fingers brushing a stray hair from her forehead with a tenderness that shattered her remaining defenses. "We need to get to the old chapel," Alaric said, his voice regaining its steel. There's a cache of communication crystals there. If I can reach the northern border lords, I can stop Silas before he declares a regency. But to get there we have to cross the royal gardens. The gardens are open ground, Clarisse noted, her mind already racing. We'll be spotted in seconds. Unless... She looked down at her dark blue dress. In the dark, this silk looks like shadows. I can move faster than you in that heavy formal coat. No, Alaric snapped. I won't use you as a decoy. I'm not asking for permission, Clarisse countered, her voice ringing with a newfound authority. You need to save your kingdom. I need to make sure Julian Thorne never looks at another woman as a piece of property again. We both have work to do. Before we see if Clarisse's daring plan works, I want to hear from you. Who do you think is the real mastermind behind Silas? Is it a rival kingdom or someone even closer to the throne? Write your theories in the comments. And if you're rooting for Clarisse and Alaric to make it out alive, show some love by hitting that subscribe button and ringing the bell. As they slipped out of the archives and toward the moonlit gardens, Clarisse realized the stakes had shifted. This wasn't just about a prince and a commoner anymore. It was about two people discarded by the world in different ways, fighting to take back the narrative of their lives. But as they reached the edge of the manicured hedges, a red dot of light appeared on Alaric's chest, a marksman's aim. Alaric, move! Clarisse screamed. The crack of the rifle echoed through the manicured hedges of the royal garden, a sound like a lightning bolt splitting an oak tree. Prince Alaric Sterling dove to the left, pulling Clarisse Lund with him into the thick, thorny embrace of the rose bushes. The bullet hissed through the air exactly where Alaric's heart had been a second before, thudding into a marble statue of a weeping angel. Stay down. Alaric hissed, his body shielding hers. The scent of crushed rose petals and gunpowder swirled around them. The marksman is on the west balcony, Clarisse whispered, her voice surprisingly steady despite the adrenaline roaring in her ears. If we move toward the reflection pool, the mist from the fountains will give us cover. They crawled through the dirt, the midnight silk of Clarisse's dress now stained with earth and royal blood where a thorn had caught Alaric's arm. They reached the edge of the old chapel, a crumbling stone structure that predated the palace itself. Inside, the air was cool and smelled of ancient incense and damp earth. Alaric moved toward the altar, his hands searching for the hidden catch that would reveal the communication crystals. But as he pressed a sequence of stones, the floor didn't just reveal a cache of crystals. It triggered a heavy stone door to slide open, revealing a sub-basement filled with crates bearing a seal Clarisse recognized instantly. It was her father's seal. The crest of the Lund Academic Foundation. What is this? Alaric breathed, holding up a lantern. The crates weren't filled with books. They were filled with the missing succession ledgers, and something far more dangerous. Thousands of forged documents linking the Sterling bloodline to a peasant uprising from 3 centuries ago. I've always hated the acoustics in this chapel, Julian, Arthur said, his voice steady and cold. Too much echoing. It makes it hard to lie convincingly. Julian scrambled backward, his hands raised, his face a mask of panicked calculation. Arthur? You're supposed to be in a gambling den in the lower city. You're a drunk, a failure. I'm a Sterling, Arthur corrected, helping Clarisse Lund to her feet. And while I enjoy a good vintage, I enjoy the stability of my cousin's throne even more. Clarisse, take this. He handed her a small, heavy iron key. It's for the North Tower. Alaric is being held in the solar. Silas hasn't moved him to the dungeons yet because he needs the boy to look presentable for the confession cameras. Clarisse gripped the key, her fingers slick with dirt and sweat. The despair that had nearly swallowed her moments ago evaporated, replaced by a white-hot, singular purpose. She wasn't just a loose thread. She was the needle. Go, Arthur commanded, keeping his weapon trained on Julian. I'll handle this vulture. The palace guard is split. Half are loyal to Silas, but the other half are waiting for a sign that the prince is still alive. Give them that sign, Clarisse. Clarisse didn't hesitate. She didn't look back at the man who had tried to poison her. She ran. She tore through the servant passages she had navigated with Alaric, her ruined midnight blue dress billowing behind her like a battle flag. Every muscle in her body ached, but her mind was a diamond, sharp and unbreakable. She reached the base of the North Tower. 2 guards stood at the entrance, their faces obscured by steel visors. Halt! one shouted, leveling a spear. The tower is restricted by order of Lord Vane. Clarisse didn't stop. She skidded to a halt just out of reach, her chest heaving. Lord Vane is a traitor. He holds the prince captive while he burns the succession ledgers to hide his own debts. She held up the heavy iron key Arthur had given her, a key that bore the royal crest Silas had tried to suppress. I am Clarisse Lund and I carry the prince's command. Move or be remembered as the men who let the monarchy die in the dark. The guards hesitated. They looked at the key, then at the woman standing before them. She was covered in mud, her hair was a bird's nest of tangles and her dress was a rag. But her eyes held the authority of a queen. Long live the prince, one guard whispered, stepping aside and slamming his fist against his chest in a salute. Clarisse sprinted up the spiral stairs, her lungs burning. She reached the solar and shoved the key into the lock. It turned with a satisfying thunk. Inside, Prince Alaric Sterling was bound to a heavy oak chair, a bloodied lip the only sign of the struggle he'd put up. When the door burst open, he looked up, expecting Silas. When he saw Clarisse, his entire expression shattered into one of pure raw relief. Clarisse, he breathed, his voice thick with emotion. You're alive. I thought. Don't think, she interrupted, rushing to his side and using a discarded letter opener to saw through his velvet restraints. We don't have time for thoughts. Arthur is holding Julian, and Silas is preparing to address the kingdom from the balcony in 10 minutes. He's going to announce your abdication. Alaric stood up, rubbing his wrists. He looked at Clarisse, taking in her disheveled appearance, the bruise on her arm and the fierce light in her eyes. He didn't say thank you. Instead, he took her hand and pressed it to his heart. You came back for me, he whispered. I came back for us, she corrected. Now, let's go show them that the Lund family forgeries aren't the only history being written tonight. The two of them stood at the top of the tower looking out over the palace grounds. Below, the torches of the divided army flickered like a sea of stars. The turning point had been reached. They weren't running anymore. They were hunting. Before we move into the final heart-pounding confrontation, I have to know, who is your favorite character so far? Is it the resilient Clarisse, the stoic Alaric, or the surprise hero Arthur? Tell me in the comments right now. And if you're ready for the climax, subscribe so you never miss a beat of this story. The rain had finally broken, leaving the Ethelgard Palace slick and shimmering under a bruised purple sky. On the great balcony, Silas Vane adjusted his spectacles, his hand trembling slightly as he gripped the edges of the marble podium. Below him, thousands of citizens and soldiers stood in a suffocating silence, their breath visible in the cold night air. People of Ethelgard, Silas's voice boomed through the amplified crystals, projected across the courtyard. It is with a heavy heart that I must announce the abdication of Prince Alaric Sterling. In light of his recent mental instability and the discovery of his involvement in the falsification of the royal succession, he has seen fit to pass the regency to the council. Beside him, Julian Thorne stood tall, dressed in a stolen officer's uniform, looking every bit the savior he had dreamed of being. He scanned the crowd, looking for the fear he thrived on. The evidence is here, Julian shouted, holding up the forged ledgers Clarisse's father had been forced to create. The Sterling line is a lie. We are the ones who. The only lie in this court is standing on that balcony. The voice didn't come from the crowd. It came from the shadows of the bell tower. Every head turned. Two figures stepped into the light of the massive palace spotlights. Prince Alaric Sterling, his chest bare of his formal medals but his posture more regal than ever, stood side by side with a woman the kingdom barely recognized. Clarisse Lund was no longer the plain girl Julian had discarded. Her midnight blue dress was shredded, her skin was smeared with soot, and she held a bundle of parchment in her hand like a holy relic. Guards! Seize them! Silas shrieked, his composure disintegrating. But the guards didn't move. They looked at Alaric, their prince who had bled with them on the borders, and then at Silas, the man who had stayed in the library. You want to talk about evidence, Julian? Clarisse stepped forward, her voice carrying a crystalline authority that silenced the entire courtyard. This isn't just a ledger. This is my father's journal. He was an academic, a man of detail. He didn't just forge your lies, he kept a record of the threats you made against my life to force his hand. He kept the receipts of the gold Silas Vane funneled from the National Treasury to pay off your gambling debts. She threw the papers over the balcony railing. They caught the wind, fluttering down into the hands of the soldiers like white birds of truth. Julian lunged for her, his face contorted with a frantic, ugly rage. "You insignificant little..." Alaric moved faster. He stepped between them, his hand catching Julian's throat in a grip of pure iron. He didn't use a sword. He didn't need one. The sheer power of a man defending what he loved was enough. "You dared to use her," Alaric growled, his voice a low, terrifying rumble that echoed through the crystals. "You dared to touch a woman worth 1,000 of you. You didn't just lose the crown, Julian. You lost your right to exist in my kingdom." With a roar of approval, the soldiers below surged forward. They didn't need an order. They recognized their king. Silas Vane collapsed to his knees, his face ghostly white as he realized the game was over. Julian was pinned to the stone, his eyes wide with the realization that the mouse he had bullied had finally led the lion to his door. Clarisse stood at the edge of the balcony looking out at the people. For the first time in her life, she didn't feel small. She didn't feel like a footnote. She felt the weight of the moment, the triumph of truth over calculated cruelty. Alaric turned away from the cowering traitors and walked toward her. In front of the entire kingdom, in front of the cameras and the 1,000-strong army, he did something no prince had ever done. He knelt. Not for a crown but for her. "Clarisse Lund," he whispered loud enough for the world to hear. "You saved the throne. But more importantly, you saved the man sitting on it." The roar of the crowd was deafening. A tidal wave of relief and celebration that shook the very foundations of the palace. The mystery was solved, the traitors were bound, and the heartbreak that had started the day had been forged into a legend. "I have to ask, was that the most satisfying takedown you've ever seen?" Seeing Julian lose everything at the hands of the woman he underestimated is just poetic justice. If you agree, smash that like button right now. And tell me in the comments, what should Julian's punishment be? The morning sun broke over the spires of Ethelgard Palace, not with the harsh glare of the previous night's spotlights, but with a soft, golden warmth that seemed to wash the very stone clean. The debris of the coup, the shattered glass, the forged ledgers and the heavy chains, had been cleared away, replaced by the industrious hum of a kingdom finding its footing again. In the royal gardens, the air was sweet with the scent of damp earth and blooming jasmine. Clarisse Lund stood by the reflection pool, the same spot where she had ducked for cover only hours ago. She was no longer wearing the midnight blue silk. It had been retired to a glass case in the palace archives as a relic of the night the monarchy was saved. Instead, she wore a simple, elegant gown of soft cream, her hair falling in natural waves, free of the tight, restrictive styles Julian Thorne had once demanded. She looked at her hands. They were steady. The woman who had entered the gala with a shattered heart and a desperate need to be seen was gone. In her place stood someone who knew her own worth didn't depend on a diamond ring or a noble's approval. "You look like you're plotting another revolution," a familiar, low voice teased. Clarisse turned to see Alaric Sterling walking toward her. He had shed his formal military regalia for a simple white shirt and dark trousers, looking less like a glacier prince, and more like a man who had finally stepped out of the shadows. He stopped just inches from her, his eyes searching hers with a tenderness that still made her breath hitch. "I think one revolution is enough for a Tuesday," Clarisse smiled, a genuine, radiant expression that reached her eyes. "I was just thinking about my father. Alaric." The council cleared his name this morning. They recognized the duress he was under. He's being offered a position as the royal archivist. He can finally protect the history he was forced to forge. Alaric took her hands in his thumbs tracing the backs of her knuckles. "He earned it. And you? The people are already calling you the Lady of Midnight. They want to know when the woman who stared down a coup is going to take her place officially by my side." Clarisse looked at the palace, then back at the man who had seen her through the dirt and the despair. "I spent so long trying to fit into a world I wasn't meant for, Alaric. I don't want to just be a lady or a princess. I want to be someone who makes sure no other woman is ever told she's a loose thread." "Then we'll build that world together," Alaric promised, his voice thick with conviction. "Not as a prince and a commoner but as equals. I don't need a queen who sits on a throne, Clarisse. I need the woman who swung a candlestick at a traitor and saved my soul." He leaned in, and this time there was no danger, no ticking clocks, and no watching eyes. The kiss was slow, certain, and tasted like a new beginning. It was the positive resolution she had never dared to dream of. A love that wasn't a transaction but a sanctuary. As they walked back toward the palace, hand in hand, the future looked brighter than any gala ballroom. Julian Thorne was facing a lifetime of exile, Silas Vane was stripped of his titles, and the kingdom was entering an era of transparency and truth. Clarice Lund had dressed up to capture a prince's heart, but in the end she had captured her own destiny. I want to thank every single one of you for staying with us through this emotional journey. Watching Clarice find her strength and her true love has been absolutely incredible. This story reminds us that no matter how hard someone tries to break you, your light can never be truly extinguished. If you loved this ending as much as I did, please leave a comment saying Clarice's triumph, and let me know what kind of story you want to hear next. Should we go back to the world of lichens, or perhaps another high-stakes royal mystery? Your suggestions drive this channel. And if you haven't yet, click that subscribe button and join our community. We have so many more 40-minute emotional adventures coming your way, and you won't want to miss a single twist. Thank you for watching, and remember, you are the author of your own story. Until next time.